All right. That's pretty interesting. 33% not heterosexual, roughly. Very interesting. Law should be based on 1, moral principles, 2, religious teachings, 3, the principle that an individual's freedom should be promoted so long as no harm is done to others. Interesting. Okay, let's go on a bit. Okay, here we have a questionnaire for all you heterosexuals. What do you think caused your heterosexuality? When and how did you first decide you were heterosexual? Is it possible that your heterosexuality is just a phase you may grow out of? If you have never slept with a member of your own sex, it is possible that you might be gay if you tried it. If heterosexuality is normal, why are there so many mental patients who are heterosexual? Why do you heterosexual people try to seduce others into your lifestyle? Why do you flaunt your heterosexuality? Can't you just be who you are and keep it quiet? So let's explore what the Bible has to say about homosexuality. Leviticus lists various sexual crimes, among them male homosexuality. So let's look at Sodom and Gomorrah. The most common interpretation of the story of Sodom is that Lot offered his virgin daughters to be raped in order to prevent the rape of male visitors unknown to the citizens of Sodom. The code of hospitality here is so strong. And so Sodom was destroyed for gross sexual immorality. So this story that tells about a father offering his daughters for gang rape, a mother who is killed because she disobeys and looks back, incest that ends with the blessing of healthy children, and the complete destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah is used to justify condemning homosexuals. There are, of course, alternative interpretations. There are scholars who argue simply that the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah were not sexual. The Jewish scholar Nachmanides wrote, "According to our sages, they were notorious for every evil, but their fate was sealed for their persistence in not supporting the poor and the needy." I'm not telling you what the interpretation of the story is, but I certainly want to raise it as a problematic story. But the other Christian arguments about homosexuality were that homosexuality was animal behavior, somehow unnatural for humans, or in a homosexual act, a man took the role of a woman. The crime, or what made homosexuality so horrible, was to be like a woman. The argument that homosexual relations made a man into a woman was actually more influential because heterosexuality is animal-like. Nobody was worried about lesbianism. There is this one passage about lesbianism in the entire Bible. It wasn't the fact that it was same-sex sex so much as what it did to the man. Leviticus states, if a man has sexual relations with a man, they are to be put to death. In 1390, a law prescribed burning at the stake as the punishment for homosexuals. And in 1532, Charles V decreed they are to be condemned to pass from life to death by fire. So, death penalty for homosexuality. And this is a representation from 1482 of a knight and his servants who were accused of being sodomites and were in fact burned outside the walls of Zurich. So my theme here is homosexuals as scapegoats. Holland, this very small country without many resources, became quite rich. But by 1730, the steep economic growth was stopping, and as economic decline ruled, a Dutch Christian right movement emerged saying that the economic problems were due to moral decay. They blamed them on what they called the sodomites. And this created an anti-sodomite hysteria in Amsterdam. In 1731, the local magistrate rounded up a few youths who'd never even heard of the word sodomite, but did confess to mutual masturbation and sexual experimentation. And they were tortured until they named accomplices. And the magistrate imprisoned 36 people. There was a trial of sorts, and 24 men and boys were publicly strangled and then burned at the stake. Between 1730 and 1733, 276 men were executed for sodomy in the Netherlands. Most of them were strangled, and that was the way in which you executed female criminals. So again, this theme of you're like a woman now. That the threat is a man is behaving like a woman. And of course, the Nazis. They turned homosexuality from a minor offense back into a felony. The pink triangle was used for gay men who were put into Nazi concentration camps. But here's the horrifying fact. When the camps were liberated by the Allied forces, that's our government, the people interned for homosexuality were not freed. And it took 100 years almost for American Psychiatric Society to remove the homosexuality being a form of pathology, an illness, an abnormality that needs to be corrected. In the 1950s, all states had some form of law criminalizing sodomy. Well, in 1969, the mayor was up for election, and he wanted to, quote, have a good image of cleaning up the city, and as a consequence, the police led a raid on a gay bar in New York that was called the Stonewall Inn. Just a seedy bar that didn't even have a liquor license, it was illegal, and most of the people who went to this bar regularly were transgendered or drag queens, mostly black and Hispanics. Nobody was going to stand up and defend. So this is the Stonewall Inn. It's just this little thing. But this was the birth of the gay movement in resistance to the kind of police violence and oppression. In 1986, the Supreme Court in the United States in Bowers versus Hardwick ruled that nothing in the United States Constitution barred a state from prohibiting sodomy. By 2003, 10 states still had laws prohibiting sodomy, and 4 states had particularly anti-homosexual laws. But in 2003, the Supreme Court reversed Bowers versus Hardwick and invalidated sodomy laws as unconstitutional violation of privacy. There is a viewpoint that human sexual desires are extraordinarily varied. And we know in every society in the world, there are people that are somewhere along in those categories. We also know that different sexual fetishes have been cultivated in different cultures. And of course, individuals have a wide variety all the way up to necrophilia. So I would argue that human beings are at least potentially polymorphous in their sexual desires that are shaped culturally, socially, religiously, and psychologically. Certain cultures have found erotic, sexually attractive, things that we would take to be very peculiar. The little golden lotus feet of Chinese women who had their feet bound. And the whole idea was that they would fit into these gorgeous little shoes. How can we understand this if it isn't that potentially our sexual desires are molded by our culture? But then, of course, what is it that makes a very thin waist so erotic? What is it that makes your breasts bulging out of the top of your dress so erotic? Why do we wear high heels if it isn't because they're somehow supposed to make you sexually more attractive? But of course, there are other examples. This is a tribe in Burma, the Padawan, who consider a long neck to be very beautiful. And as with Chinese foot binding, they have to start when a girl is 5 years old and has no control at all. This deformation is so bad that if you took the rings off of a grown woman's neck, her neck would break and she'd die. And then, of course, there's a whole bunch of piercing and tattooing customs throughout the world. This isn't actually the one I was looking for, but it's a form of lip piercing that is also considered quite erotically beautiful. Have I convinced you that culture can shape people's sense of what is sexually exciting? I want to raise the possibility in your minds that we are born potentially bisexual, but that our culture tends to make us heterosexual. That's what we're told we should be. And it also tends to make us try to fit the gender stereotypes of our culture, that girls should be like this and that boys should be like that. That's my first point. We need to reconsider sexuality. As for people who happen to be homosexual, the question is gay a lifestyle? That's a sort of ordinary American way of treating it. But most gay people would say, I'm me. My identity doesn't amount to being part of a gay lifestyle. They are just as different from each other as heterosexuals are. It doesn't matter. If you buy the argument that human desires are polymorphous, human sexual, that means there is a range that some of which is probably unacceptable for every person in this room. And in fact, we don't want any kind of sexual expression to be okay. So, what would the world be like without constraints on sexuality? Secondly, what kinds of constraints then could we collectively agree on, drawing from our traditions, from our intuitions, and how would we justify those constraints? What is the role of law in setting the limits of what is permissible sexually? And this has to do with age limits, for instance. And what is the role of religion in shaping our culture's sexual practices?
I wonder how many people, if it wasn't looked down upon, would say, wow, that's cool, I can go with a couple little kids today, or maybe 6 or 7 women and men. I just wonder how many people that would be, like, who would change their lifestyle because it was socially accepted. You know?
I would think that it would get worse without constraints.
I don't think it would change that much at all, actually. I think it just wouldn't be as secretive. Things wouldn't be in the shadows.
Like, there'd still be a law against rape.